the demos that I'm going to do for you here today will include the tzatziki and the Spanikopita, that's the, as well as the hummus. And then I'm also going to show you the proper cooking technique, which is quite basic, for your couscous, actually instant couscous. There's two kinds that are traditional from that part of the world, instant and Israeli. The instant is a freeze-dried pasta, and the Israeli is also pasta, but it's not been par-cooked. They're dried as well. So the instant couscous is just a rehydration process, where the Israeli couscous and other varieties are generally cooked by the standard pasta method in boiling salted water until al dente or to the doneness desired. So to get started today, for your Spanikopita, it involves two things. It involves a filling, and it involves then an assembly in a dough. The filling is made of spinach, feta cheese, onions, eggs, and some herbs. The phyllo dough is a ready-made dough. You've probably worked with it before, but possibly not, and we'll talk about the special characteristics that make phyllo dough a little temperamental, but also very delicious to eat once the dish is done. For the Spanikopita, and it calls for a half a pound of spinach washed. I'm actually doing a half recipe here. So this amount of spinach is a quarter pound of spinach. Please weigh your spinach. It's hard to eyeball. Leafy greens are not very heavy. And even though this looks like a lot, when I cook this, wilt it, it's going to be able to fit inside the palm of my hand very easily. It becomes a very small amount. So your first step tells you to place the spinach and water in a saucepan over high heat. Basically, we're just going to cook it. So any kind of a pan that will contain the spinach is perfectly fine. You just add it all into the pot, stems and all, because this is going to be chopped, and this is baby spinach, so the stems are tender. The water that we need is just enough water, a scant amount, to create some steam and wilt it. If you've ever cooked spinach before, which I'm sure most of you have had some experience cooking a leafy green, you know it cooks very quickly, and it's mostly water, so it's going to shrink down, and that's all we're looking to do is basically cook it. So spinach in the pot, on the stove with a little bit of water. As soon as you see a little steam coming up, you can pop something over it to cover it up. If you have a lid, that's fine, but bowls work fine too. And just let it steam for about 1 minute or so until it shrivels down and is completely wilted and cooked. This same recipe can also be done using frozen chopped spinach if you're doing this at home or out in the industry. Because basically the first step is we're cooking it to the same stage where you would find frozen chopped spinach. If you were doing this with frozen chopped spinach, you'd want to thaw it and do what I'm going to do as the second step with the fresh spinach, and that's wring out the excess moisture through cheesecloth, because in all cases, spinach is full of water, and we don't want a watery filling inside of a flaky dough. We want a relatively dry filling that just will be savory but not very wet and soggy for best results. The spinach is just starting to wilt. The other part of this filling that we're going to do involves sweat the onions till just before browning. And when they're partially sweated, we can also throw in the green onions and let them soften a little bit too. So I'm going to warm up my oil. I'm not sauteing, so I don't need to get my pan screaming hot. I'm sweating, so I'm going to put my onions right in with the oil as it's heating and allow them to start sweating out. I can see steam emerging already out of my spinach pot, and I'm fairly confident at this point that I can just turn it off and let it sit. It's already cooked. So as the onions are beginning to sweat, I'm going to go ahead and drain the spinach, and you'll see I'm going to drain it back into this bowl. Just pouring it out of the pan, of course, I have a little bit of water. You really need to either let this cool down and squeeze it through cheesecloth, or using something firm, press the spinach into the colander or the china cap and extract as much liquid as possible. See how much more liquid comes out of the spinach as you press on it. So we really want to get all of that liquid out. It's important that this is not watery. And even though that looked like a fairly big bag of spinach, you can see already that all of the spinach that's left is fitting into a small little spot in the bottom of this china cap. And that's all that I have left. As I mentioned, it would fit in the palm of my hand. it's important that you also take the step and chop your spinach coarsely. Got the onions sweating. And they're going to be added to the bowl as well. The additional ingredients that go into this filling are the herbs that we have, which are parsley and dill, and green onions, which also get sweat a little bit with the onions that I already have sweating over here. Let them soften up and then turn it off. I want to let this cool slightly before adding it into the rest of the filling because there's going to be cheese in there and I don't want to melt out the cheese. I want the cheese to stay in chunks. Okay, this is fine, softened a bit, and I'm going to just turn this off and let it sit while I get the rest of the items ready for the filling. You're going to hold this filling, bind it together by, with the one beaten egg. So I've got beaten egg, I've got my cheese, I've got my herbs. Parsley can go in with the spinach. Dill can go on in with the spinach. And this filling also gets a scant amount of nutmeg, which is a very classical pairing in the Middle East and in Europe with spinach. It's very, very classical. So a small amount of nutmeg goes into this filling as well. You'll find that this is common in Greek cuisine. In lamb dishes, nutmeg, cinnamon sometimes finds its way onto the savory side. So it's an interesting, play with flavors. We can go ahead and add the cheese in. The onion mixture should be okay to add at this point, not too hot. My beaten egg can go in. It's a binder. Hold it together. And then we've got everything else in here already. So basically, it's just a question of folding the filling ingredients together and then seasoning with some salt and pepper, because we didn't put seasoning in. Now, on the salt part, it's not really going to be recommendable to taste this with the raw egg in it so much. But remember, when you're adding salt, not to go too heavy because your feta cheese has got a salty component to it. It's a fairly salty cheese. Pepper, go to taste on that. You can certainly add a little seasoning before you add the egg if you wish, and taste it if that's a preference to you. But we want to get a little seasoning in there for sure because, again, it's going inside a pastry and we don't want our end result to be bland. Got some pepper. Just combine the seasoning in here. And the next part will be an assembly. And for the assembly, we need melted butter. It can be whole butter or clarified butter. It doesn't matter for this, either one. Because we're going to brush each layer of the phyllo dough with butter to keep it moist and keep it from drying up on us while we're working with it. So each time I take a sheet off, I'm going to roll it back up in this plastic carefully before I start working with it to keep the rest of it from drying out. I'm going to take one sheet out and put it over here and let it dry out and show you how quickly that happens so you see what will happen to your phyllo dough if you're not careful. Roll it out gently. Oh, this has a bunch of rips in it too, so I'm going to be able to show you how to work with broken phyllo dough and make it work. Hopefully. You can see that there's a lot of rips and tears in this. I'm going to sit this off to the side and just let it get dry. Take some of its little bits and pieces with it. The first piece you have to be the most gentle with. It's most urgent. Melted butter doesn't need to be boiling hot when you use it. It's better if it's just warm. So I'm going to dip my brush and shake it off and let it warm down a little bit. For each sheet of phyllo dough, we need to brush it with butter. And the first sheet being very brittle, we have to kind of hold it in place and very gently brush it. We want to put on plenty of butter on the first sheet, and the subsequent sheets will get a little bit less each time. So I'm going to unroll my dough again and get out a second sheet to put on top. The Spanikopita that we're going to make is going to consist of 3 layers of dough before the filling goes in. To assemble, I want to make 6 separate strips, but you see I've got a lot more structure and strength now with 3 sheets. Still delicate, but it's a lot stronger than it was. To get my 6 pieces out of this, what I'd like to do now is find your middle approximately, score it lightly. You don't hear me scraping on the table. And this will perforate and separate into 2 pieces. So now I've got 2 separate halves. Divide each half into 3 strips. So we've got 6 strips now. 6 individual strips, and the simple assembly is just like folding the American flag. So we'll take a spoonful, not too much, about a rounded teaspoonful for this size. Spanikopita could be made larger, but that's plenty. You don't want to overstuff it. Nice rounded mound on the end of each piece. This is finger food, so it's good for cocktail parties. You'll notice that my first folds, because the dough is really messy, don't look very pretty. It looks really bad. But by the time I get to the end of this, it's going to look okay, because all of the crusty looking broken up dough is on the inside now. And I've come to the end. I can either fold over the end or I can trim it off lightly to make it neat. So now I've got a finished Spanikopita ready to go into the oven, and the last thing that you want to do with each finished piece is to give it one final light brush on the top only to keep it from drying out. And last but not least, so my phyllo dough. This is a piece that's just been sitting out for a few minutes. You see what happens. It's not completely dry yet, but it dries very, very quickly. So as you can see, and as I mentioned, once you trim and fold your finished pieces, even though I started off with pretty ratty looking phyllo dough, end up looking fine. And once they bake in the oven, they will be nice and golden, and all of the flakiness will be desirable at that point. So, Spanikopita. That's it for the Spanikopita. The next item, since we did the Spanikopita, I'll go ahead and do the tzatziki, the yogurt and cucumber sauce next. And this is also very basic and very simple, your tzatziki recipe. What we want is a peeled and seeded cucumber for this. And you want your thickened yogurt. Your thickened yogurt, it still should be a little bit thicker than by dripping this off, and I think it will be a little bit more luxurious. But in that it didn't get as thick as the standard Greek yogurt or the organic style, we want to be extra careful when we are folding together this tzatziki. You can see that the yogurt's a little bit thicker than it was, a little bit more creamy. So hopefully it will still be a little bit better than just using it straight out of the container. Ideally, though, you'll want to use for this in the future an organic style yogurt that is separable. For this, we want to use, as I mentioned, a cucumber that has been seeded, and then you want to grate it or chop it finely. Traditionally, we grate it on the larger opening of a box grater. What is cucumber full of like spinach? Water. And again, because we're trying to make this a thick sauce and we thicken the yogurt by removing the water, the last thing that we're going to want to do is put the cucumber water now back in to our tzatziki. So the best way I know of to get the water out of the cucumber is after you've shredded it up like so, press it or take a piece of cheesecloth and wring it out like an old rag into the sink. You'll be amazed how much water will come out, and that's what you want to do, is get it all out. You'll still have plenty of the cucumber flavor, but you won't have all that liquid to make it a goopy mess. So when you're done, you've got grated up cucumber, which you can collect into a piece of clean cheesecloth, or you can put it into a chinois or a china cap and press on it like I did with the spinach, but the cheesecloth will work just fine. Unfold it so that you can accommodate your cucumber inside. And then twist. So now I've got some nice cucumber pulp that's not as watery. Cucumber in the bowl that's been wrung out. And I want to have a half cup of yogurt. And we're going to combine it gently together, no whisking. Sometimes the recipes say blend together, and people confuse that and put it all into a blender. You end up with cold cucumber soup when you blend this. It's not the right consistency. Your herbs are, your choice of herbs for this, I believe the recipe calls for mint, but you can use dill, mint, or a combination. Today I'm going to use a combination of dill, mint. Garlic is a component of tzatziki. Some people like it really garlicky. Remember though, if you're making this for use on a following day, not for the same day, You might want to not put as much garlic as you think because the garlic blooms out overnight and can become overpowering. You can always add a little bit more on the day of service, but if it's too strong, it's hard to undo that at that point. So I'm going to put in some of this chopped garlic and the lemon juice. Some people will also add a little lemon zest in, but very fine lemon zest that you've done on a microplane. It adds a nice little hints of color of yellow and gives another element of lemony flavor. When you are done, your tzatziki is not a pourable sauce. It should not be. It should be a nice thick dip like so. Make sure we get a little salt. Again, yogurt has its own salt content. And in this case, if I want to add pepper, the ideal one is going to be your white pepper because you don't want black flecks in a yogurt-based sauce as much. So we're going to add a little bit of white pepper in, fold it together, and then it would be ready to either be refrigerated and wait for service or to be plated. But this kind of item benefits from a little resting time so that the flavors can meld together. So, you know, immediately serving it, it would be better to prep it a little bit in advance in the morning for an afternoon service or the day before. We would plate it maybe in a ramekin along with pita breads and other items that you could serve alongside on a platter. Say we had these already cooked off, we could present it together with the Spanikopita as part of a meze service or something like that. Couscous is a form of pasta. It's instant, par-cooked, freeze-dried pasta when we're talking about the default or the standard couscous, which is known as instant couscous or just couscous. It's most traditional from North Africa, from Morocco, and those areas. And if you say couscous alone, generally what's going to be understood as the instant couscous. We generally will specify if we're looking for Israeli couscous or some other kind. For the couscous that we're making in this class, or at any time when you're using a couscous recipe, it's a procedure more than a recipe. It's basically a hydration, and we're going to use equal parts for the dried couscous, the freeze-dried couscous, and equal parts of liquid. It can be water with salt or just plain. It can be stock. It could be other liquids that you could hydrate it with. If you wanted to do a fruited couscous, you might use some fruit juice in the hydration process as well for a sweet presentation. You might then also combine other flavoring components into it as you like. For this, we're going to just heat the stock, and we're going to melt butter in with the stock, and so this will get a little richness and will keep the grains a little bit separate. And we're going to just heat that together until the butter's melted and the liquid is boiling. Then we'll pour it directly over the couscous and let it sit for 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes covered to hydrate it. That's all we do. There's no cooking on the stove for couscous, for the instant couscous. It's a hydration in your serving pot. It's a great one to know for the restaurant industry because if you run out of a starch, you can have this up on your line in 10 minutes. You know, there's very few other starches, rice or anything that you can cook so quickly and have it taste good. You can certainly buy instant rice and things, but it doesn't taste as good. But couscous actually tastes good, and it's a great vehicle to add other flavors. We can add almost anything into it, plumped dried fruits or just dried fruits, nuts, or if you want to stay more Middle Eastern, we could add sliced olives, toasted pine nuts, cumin seed, herbs, preserved lemon, grated up a little bit, feta cheese, any kind of flavoring, sun-dried tomatoes would go in with the Middle Eastern flavors or the Mediterranean flavors. So I'm going to place my dry, freeze-dried pasta into the bowl. I'm heating up the liquid, and then I'm going to hydrate it. Once it's hydrated, I'll add my additional components and toss it together, and it's ready to serve. It's a question about when you add them. For example, I could put the olives in with the dry and some of the stuff in there, but I don't really want to put the nuts in there because I want them to stay a little crunchy, personal preference. And I don't want to put the cheese in there yet because I don't want it to melt out. I'd like it to stay in little chunks. And the herbs, I like them to stay bright green, so I'm going to add all of those after the fact. But I think I'll combine a little bit of olive because they won't be harmed much from the water. So I'm going to put some of the olives and some of the toasted cumin seed in with the dry and let it all hydrate together and flavor. You have to be careful if you're using dried fruits, though, and you don't want to change the color. If you hydrate the fruits in with it, you might get a reddish-colored couscous from the berries, depending on which fruits you use. Yeah, some roasted cumin seed will make a nice addition to this. And I think that's all I'll put in for now. I've already got my liquid boiling because it wasn't very much with the butter. So we just give it a pour over. And of course, we want to give it a little stir because otherwise you might get some clumping. And then we're going to just cover it up. So that's all it takes to make couscous. 5 minutes from now, this is good to go. Of course, I would add, if I want to, my other flavoring components. So we just cover it up with some plastic to keep the heat in. And let it do its thing. That is how we make instant couscous. Your hummus is your garbanzo bean puree. It revolves around garbanzo beans as a base, olive oil, tahini, lemon juice, and garlic with salt and pepper. Variations on this recipe might include pureeing Kalamata olives in and making a Kalamata olive hummus. Roasted red peppers can be pureed in and it gives a kind of a pink color, and various other things can be added. Also, hummuses are sometimes made with different legumes, but most classically, it's the chickpea or garbanzo bean. Okay, so I've got a cup of garbanzos drained. Garlic. Okay, great. So throw everything in and then just grind it to a paste. You can do it that way. You can also start grinding the ingredients and drizzle the oil in, but it's not an emulsion like that. So I've got the garbanzo beans, tahini, which is a sesame paste. It looks and smells a little bit like peanut butter. We'll be doing a pass around of ingredients later, and you'll get to see this up close so you know what you're working with if you haven't seen it before. We've got lemon juice, and I'll reserve some back just in case I need more. It's never an exact thing how much you put in of these things because it may need a little more smoothness, it may need more acidity, and so on and so forth. And I'll put some of the oil in, and then as it's turning, drizzle some in through the top. I know that this is going to need just a bit of salt. And a cover. What we don't put in with the processor for this is we don't put in the parsley or the za'atar, sumac, or paprika, depending on what you're using. Those are only sprinkled on top. We don't want to blend those in because they give it the wrong color and the flavor permeates too much. It's more of a topping. Because we're making not very large quantities and the bowls of these are fairly large, it's important to stop every few minutes or so while you're processing and scrape down the side of the processor so that you can make sure that everything's getting ground up and smooth. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more of my lemon juice in and finish drizzling in my oil. Traditional presentations of this dish in the Middle East are generally in a bowl, smoothed out, and then more indentations are made in it where olive oil is poured directly into the little holes. In case it becomes crusty on the surface, you mix it back in. Or a little moat is made around the edge, and olive oil is drizzled into the moat around the edge as a way of presenting. And you generally serve this with warm pita breads to eat it with. So a smoother flat plate is more traditional, or can be more traditional for the service style. We would spread it out nice and smooth, surround it with pitas, sprinkle some parsley, sumac, and or za'atar. And I'm going to use parsley and za'atar today. And as mentioned, you can make little holes or indentations and pull in some olive oil. Of course, when you're making this, I would implore you to taste it before you take it out of the processor, because if you want to make adjustments, it's easier while you still got the processor set up to go. Tastes pretty good. It's a little lemony. So it's good to taste it. I should do the same. And we have some za'atar. Sprinkle around. Some plain sumac for a contrasting color, which is also in the za'atar. And maybe a little sprinkling of parsley for the green, and also a traditional accompaniment in Mediterranean flavors and Middle Eastern flavors. If you wanted to do the oil pools, if I can get them, and then you would pour directly into the holes little pools of olive oil. And then serve with warm pita breads. Finally, to finish off the couscous, we've got a little bit of roasted pine nuts for this one. And again, what you put in it is up to you. You don't have to put anything other than the couscous in it, and salt and butter if you like, a little bit of crumbled feta, but additional ingredients are sometimes desirable, depending on what you're doing. A little parsley for green. And this should also then be folded together and fluffed as you fold it, because it's pretty solid in the bottom, but as I turn it and move it, I'm fluffing it up. And you want to fluff this up a little and break up any clumps. The butter should help it to stay separate. And you've got a nice light pasta dish ready to go as an accompaniment for traditional Middle Eastern fare.